the beginning of the 20th century, almost half of America's population lived on farms, and more than half the population lived in rural areas. So farms had two purposes. They would feed the family or families that worked them, and they would also produce a bit extra to sell. On the farm I now own, for example, there was a hops field, which would have been the main cash crop. So the hops would be picked, bundled, and shipped off to breweries. But there's also dairy, beef, almost certainly a few pigs, probably some wheat or corn, and hay for the winter. Even though the Talbot family owned it, it was part of a larger economy. Hops pickers would come in seasonally, and there was a little hired hand's house on the other side of the road. The next 100 years, the entire 20th century, were basically continuous slow consolidation. By the 1920s, hops production had moved out to the West Coast, and dairy began to be a bigger and bigger part of farming in New York. So this farm and its neighbors relied increasingly on the sale of milk. And there was this sort of golden age from the late 50s to the early 1980s, during which it was possible for a family farm with a decent number of cows to provide a solid middle-class life. But even during that period, the average size of farms kept creeping up and the smallest farms kept closing. When I first moved up here, a man named Don was my neighbor. He was about 80 and he'd lived and farmed right here his entire life, mostly milking cows, so I paid attention when he talked. His dad had seen the hops industry collapse and told Don that he would live to see the cows go too. Unfortunately, this has proved to be true. There are fewer family dairies every year. While New York as a state produces more milk than ever, it's all happening in bigger and bigger dairies, usually with thousands of cows living their entire lives inside huge barns. This sort of farming requires a particular geography. There has to be a lot of flat land all in one place. That does not describe my little valley or most of New York for that matter, which means that the working farms around here have simply stopped working. It's very easy to see how this has happened, with technology, processing, and agricultural policy at the state and national level all working together to encourage consolidation. It's also worth saying that this has worked extremely well so long as the goal is to reduce the cost of food. But there are a lot of problems that have come along with it. There's the environmental costs, the animal welfare issues, and the destruction of rural communities. More immediately these days, coronavirus has highlighted the risks of a highly centralized food system, at least one that's pretty much only optimized for efficiency. I think it's true that this is a good time to discuss what we want our food system to look like, but we need to be careful. It's tempting to say that a more local food system would have done better with the current crisis. It seems self-evident that this is the truth, but I'm not so sure. First off, there's no particular reason to think that a local distribution network would have had an easier time taking half the food in the pipeline that was destined for restaurants and getting it to individuals in their homes. A more interesting case is the problems the meat supply is having, because those do have their root and scale. The main issue there is that meat packers in America are immense, which makes it difficult to control the spread of a virus. It also means that closing just a few plants results in a real disruption of the supply chain. A network of smaller, more dispersed slaughterhouses would be a more resilient system. But far cheaper and even less vulnerable to disruption, at least by disease, would be to keep packing plants as big as they are and to just automate most of the butchering. Even better than that would be lab-grown meat, which could theoretically go from production to whoever's going to eat it without getting near a pair of human hands. What I'm saying is there's a risk in hitching agricultural reforms to the current crisis, tempting though it is. The trajectory I described a minute ago, the fact that agriculture keeps consolidating so relentlessly, must be kept in mind. Any straightforwardly utilitarian goal can be addressed by the current system, simply by shifting some incentives. Whether it's preparing for the next pandemic or improving soil health or whatever else, farming as it is currently configured can do it. No matter how you look at it, local farming will always be more expensive than industrial agriculture, and it will never be as quick to offer easy responses to national problems. So what is the case for farms like mine? What do we want agriculture to look like? I've thought about this a lot, and the answer is that I don't know. I really don't know how to balance productivity with resilience, what form subsidies should take, if we need price support or quota or land reform or tariffs, or broad cultural changes or something else. Instead, I'm going to make a proposal that is completely impractical, but the closest I can come to formulating a true guiding principle for farming. I think we should strive to make an agricultural system that accounts for absolutely everything. Of course, it needs to produce good food, and it needs to take care of the obvious stuff like the environment, animals, and the broader ecosystem. But it should also support human flourishing, and I don't just mean that it should pay farmers enough to live on. I mean it should support a stable, coherent community in which people live well together. Finally, it should be beautiful. Farms should give the landscape meadows, woods, and grazing livestock all managed to make the country more lovely than it would be without them. We should be willing to trade quite a lot of mindless efficiency for something broadly and meaningfully enriching. I'm Garth Brown from Carencrest Farm. Thank you for watching.